There's this massive, almost universal trigger for childhood PTSD symptoms, and you probably have it. I think a lot of people have it, not just those of us with childhood PTSD. And if you're like most people, you've never realized it. It's a trigger that happens all the time, and it's hurrying. Hurrying. It's so normal, right? We all do it. We do it all the time. But when you have childhood PTSD, hurrying very easily turns into overwhelm. And though you probably think, well, it's not possible to live without hurrying and getting overwhelmed a lot of the time. There's just so much to do, right? But if you're hurrying, when you're doing your job or caring for your kids, it can trip you up and sabotage the most important things in your life. Because for people with trauma, hurrying sets off dysregulation. Now, no one ever told me this, but once I knew what neurological dysregulation was, and I started working hard to get re-regulated again, that's what I'm always teaching about on this channel, right? And I realized that hurrying was right up there with the biggest triggers like abandonment, getting criticized, getting physically threatened. I think hurrying is a massive trigger that nobody talks about. I have it bad when I hurry a lot because I'm always trying to do a little bit more than is physically possible. It's just kind of how I am. Once in a while, like everyone with childhood PTSD, I get overwhelmed and dysregulated. Now, if you don't know about dysregulation, in a nutshell, this is the core symptom for adults who had trauma as kids, and it drives most of the other symptoms. And everybody gets dysregulated sometimes. Most people can re-regulate themselves fairly quickly, but for those of us who were abused or neglected as kids, we have a tendency to get dysregulated more easily, and we have a harder time coming back from it. And what it is if you do a brain scan, brain waves that normally are operating in sync together react to a trigger. A trigger is like a thing that happens. It could be like a internal reaction to something, or, a car almost hits you. So when we say trigger here, we're not just talking about like something that's upsetting. We're talking about it sets off dysregulation in the nervous system. So brain waves that normally are operating in sync together react to a trigger by going out of sync. They kind of go all over the place, and we get triggered by something. Something kicks off an emotion. Usually it's not even a conscious thing that anything has happened, but things start to get discombobulated in your body and your coordination. Your thinking gets scattered. Your mind might race. Your heart races. Your emotions might come out kind of, overly strong. And this is what you can feel when dysregulation is happening. But it's something that's strongly impacting your nervous system, which in turn drives a lot of functions that you can't directly feel, like your hormones or your immune system. So it can be very pervasive, these effects of dysregulation. And the trick of healing CPTSD is to be able to notice that you're dysregulated and then to get re-regulated as quickly as possible. So I noticed that hurrying and getting overwhelmed were huge triggers for me. And I teach about this in my dysregulation bootcamp. And that's an online course I teach. You can always find it down in the description section below all the videos. Hit that little more thing so you can open the whole thing up and you can find links, or you can get over to my website, or you can learn all about dysregulation and re-regulation in my book, Re-Regulated. And there's always a link to that down below too. But just for now, I want to give you some tips on how to notice when the hurrying trigger is happening and how you can start to change that. So hurrying is super normalized in our culture, and I'm not even saying that's bad. It's just how it is for a lot of us. It's everything from trying to get out the door in the morning to driving in a rushed way, through traffic to get places, feeling like, I got to get there, I'm late. Being late is also a trauma symptom, and they go together. So it's just getting overwhelmed with everything that you're trying to get done in a day. And it can definitely strike when you're helping kids or working with other people, stuff that busy people do. You start to hurry. It's a very normal thing. And here's the thing, most hurrying is necessary not because of society, not because of technology. We talk about that stuff, but really, what it's really from is more ordinary than that. And you know what it is? Are you ready? It's procrastination. It is. We all do it. Maybe you don't get up out of bed after the alarm goes off, or you don't get out the door or leave enough time to get where you're trying to go. Do you do that? I do. And what's one huge reason we procrastinate? Right back to the beginning, dysregulation. So it's a vicious circle: procrastinating, dysregulating, hurrying, dysregulating, procrastinating, and doing it again. So our minds go down that road easily, but our minds love a sense of spaciousness in time. So taking your time is wonderfully re-regulating. When is the last time that you took a shower and you stopped and you just enjoyed the feeling of the water? Or you brushed your teeth without feeling pressured to hurry up, spit it out, get it all done, do the blah, 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 rinse your mouth, wipe your face, hurry up. This pushing all the time can overwhelm your nervous system, and overwhelm all by itself triggers dysregulation, or it can. It just so happens that our minds love doing things with careful attention. But the PTSD in us feels scared of slow, mindful processes because the bad feelings might get in. Do you have that? There have been times when I stopped to think about why I was hurrying so much all the time, and the best I could come up with was that I felt like something was chasing me. And I gave a name to it. I call it a pack of wolves. It's not really wolves. That's not how I see it. But it's as if I have to keep going really fast or something's going to catch up with me. And funnily enough, when I sat in meditation and I imagined wolves coming to get me and I just let it happen, nothing terrible happened. I mean, there aren't actually wolves. It was emotion, and that's what was coming to get me. And it was a feeling, usually sadness. And at the very worst, I might have had a little cry, and then the feeling passes. It's not actually so terrible. And if you can let that feeling kind of wash through you, you don't have to hurry so much. You don't have to keep running or delaying so that everything's time compressed. You can just take things at a healthy pace for you and for your mind. And sometimes this helps you get more done, not less. Going slower, yes. For a long time, I was running and I hurried. And in my kind of dysregulation, hurrying makes me start losing my keys and spilling coffee down my shirt or driving over curbs when I'm turning corners in a way that's not good for my tires. So in the end, I can end up running late because I'm hurrying. Now, one time, in a 2-week period where I was intensely dysregulated, something really bad had happened, and I was really, really in my PTSD symptoms, but I drove away from the gas station with the pump still in my car. I did that twice, actually, and the people were in the gas station going, hey, trying to yell after me, but I didn't hear them. I was like lost in my head. And then also during that period of time, I rear-ended a truck on the freeway. And luckily they had like a stainless steel bumper. Like I stopped, I got out of the car, and they just like waved me on. They didn't care, but I cared, and my car was messed up. Rear-ending someone because I was dysregulated actually made me, guess what? More dysregulated. And that's why now that I understand dysregulation, I have a rule: no driving while dysregulated. In some ways, it's just as bad as driving drunk. And it helps make it clear how important it is to get re-regulated, to get really good at that. But like with the gas pump, when I did that, talk about brain waves going all over the place. My brain, the waves, it's like they were, instead of running like water, they're running over rocks, like rapids, just, and it's so hard when you're dysregulated to stay focused enough to do one thing, let alone a sequence of things like put your credit card in the pump, put in your zip code, pump the gas, wait, then take the pump out and put it back in its holder, screw the cap on, yes, and then also shut that little door that covers the gas cap, and then get back in the car and start to drive and go away and pay attention to other cars in front of you on the freeway and stay focused on the task driving. Like, it's a lot, right? It's obvious how important it is to be present for that. But if you've ever been dysregulated, you know exactly what I mean, how all of this can go wrong. You sort of are relying on autopilot, but autopilot's not working when you're dysregulated. So I had this spell in my life where that's what it was. Just things had gotten really hard, and I was under a lot of stress, and I didn't have a name for what was wrong. And in a way, I'm grateful for those times because, well, I'm grateful nobody was hurt by my driving at that time, and also because struggling like that propelled me to find out what complex PTSD is. It's the kind of PTSD that comes from chronic, ongoing exposure to intense stress, usually from childhood. And it was only 10 years ago I learned what it even was. And this is relatively new knowledge, and even your doctor and therapist might not know about it. Luckily, they're coming on board with it, which is very good news for people like you and me. When I'm dysregulated, I can't totally feel my body. I'll start bumping into, things, hitting my head or dropping plates when I'm trying to wash them. My handwriting changes. Do you have that? And the worst of it is I can't get anything done. When I'm dysregulated, I'm sitting there and I start a task and then I get distracted and I go do something else. And some researchers say that a lot of people who have been diagnosed with ADHD, which is what this sounds like, right? But a lot of them might actually have complex PTSD. The symptoms in some ways mimic ADHD because of that difficulty paying attention and staying on task. The difference is that with CPTSD, you can learn to re-regulate pretty quickly. And you might have to get re-regulated several times throughout the day, but you can come right back and get back to what you were doing. So to reduce the need of hurrying, I recommend using lists. Yeah, I know you thought I would say something much more exciting than that, but lists. I use an app on my laptop called Kanban Flow. It's Kanban Flow that lets me type in things that I want to get done, and I can do it in columns that I've created, and I can color code them and drag them around and name the columns whatever I want. They're usually named for days, and then I have other ones that are for like new ideas for videos and things that have to get done for our taxes to be filed. I can just keep track of everything, and I look at it. I pay attention to this list, like in the morning and the evening, and sometimes throughout the day. I delete things, I check my board, I delete things I've completed, and keep checking, how am I doing? Am I keeping up with what I planned? And I tend to be a little overambitious in what I put on my board, but I'm okay with that. I can move it into the next day. My mind loves to do a lot of things, but even more, it loves order. And in fact, order creates more order in your life. So the more I work in a structured fashion, the less dysregulated I get. And then more time opens up in my day to continue to have creative thoughts or to be physically aware of myself and aware of time passing. So I can instinctively tell when it's time to get ready for something that's been scheduled, the kind of thing I used to always be late to. The irony about hurrying is it just ends up making everything take longer. So you do have time to slow down. Believe it, you have time to slow down. Slowing down creates time. And slowing down is really good for kids. You probably remember the feeling. Going slowly is why some of us like the kids' TV show Mr. Rogers so much. I grew up on that, very important to me. He was the master of slow, mindful actions. Or a lot of people like Bob Ross, the painter. You can go right into a state of calm watching somebody do something slowly like he did with his paintings, talking gently about what he was doing with the happy trees. We know that complex PTSD can make it hard to process thoughts and feelings, and they literally get backed up in your conscious awareness. And there's too much going on in there. So when you try to find your keys or the address where you're going, these little things can just be too much. So we all feel good when we can tune in to a more natural pace where we can think and be aware and think through what's next. This is a state where we can learn. And you've probably had people in your life who modeled that for you and helped you learn. That's something worth being grateful for. The people who followed a natural pace, and it allowed you to find a natural pace. It's a little different for each person, but those people are very comforting to be around. You might want to just think about in your life, was there a teacher or a friend's mom or a relative who was like that for you? A lot of people use meditation to sort of tune in and drop back into their bodies and allow their capacity to pay attention, to gradually well up again. And this is really powerful for CPTSD healing. You'll hear me teaching this in all my courses. It's the foundation of being able to heal. It's the first thing to learn how to do. When you're feeling overhurried, one thing that you can do is to simply slow down. Just drop to half speed for a minute or two. Like you might only need to go at half speed to just finish washing a cup or pulling clothes out of the dryer. so that you're not just banging around, hitting your hand on the edges of the dryer or dropping things like I do when dysregulated. Just slow it down to half speed. And when you do this, your movements send a signal back to your brain to come back from dysregulation and back into a regulated state. So if you can learn to do this around hurrying or anything that gets you dysregulated and frustrated, if you can change your dysregulation, you can change the course of your whole life. It's the dysregulation. That's at the root of so many childhood PTSD symptoms, including the health problems, including the cognitive problems, including the sense of loneliness and lashing out at people and feeling like you can't connect with them at all. Learning to re-regulate is the number one thing you can do to start healing all these other aspects of your trauma. There's an almost universal symptom that people who grew up with trauma will tend to exhibit, and it's a sense of isolation. Either you feel isolated with people or you literally isolate from them. And that's the one I want to talk about, because shutting people out may feel like it's the right and best and most self-caring thing that you can do sometimes when you're under stress and feeling triggery, but it may be trapping you and keeping you stuck. Now, let's just admit it. For people with CPTSD, being around people is full of triggers. And by trigger, I mean a stimulus or an experience that sets off neurological dysregulation, where you feel discombobulated, you feel off, your emotions are kind of hard to manage. Being around people when you are prone to getting dysregulated, it's like they're a basement full of mouse traps and there's no light and you don't want to go in there. So at first it feels really good to just not go in there, to pull back from people and to make an excuse or cancel a plan or end a relationship just so that you can get a little breathing room and, keep your head together. But here's the thing, if you keep using isolation to manage your CPTSD triggers, just about every opportunity to belong with other people will gradually close off to you. And if you think that's a good thing, that is probably your trauma talking. And maybe you're good at tolerating your loneliness. I get letters from people like that all the time. I like being alone. I hate people. People are awful. I have everything I need without anybody to help me. And I understand that for people who are severely traumatized, pulling away from people is the most therapeutic thing you can do. There's a period of time when it's too much to bear. And I think there are a few people out there where they can manage to go their whole life and not deal with people, and they prefer it. But if you don't have a bank account that will support that, if you don't have someone who gets your groceries and deals with, your bills and things for you, well, isolating can only work for a short time. I wouldn't say that learning to live without people is a virtue. Shutting people out, it's not an accomplishment. It doesn't make you the winner of a trauma game or anything. It takes you out of the circle of life where so much of our growth happens, where so much of the good that we bring to the world happens. And I'll talk about that, but let me just say to people who brag about being good at being isolated, I don't want anybody to have to be good at isolating. When you're doing it by choice, when you're doing it to do something productive, that's called solitude. It's a different thing. I'm talking about isolating. And it's better to be uncomfortable with people. It's better to be sad about the relationships that are lost to you or blocked for you. It's better to struggle a bit with the way that feeling criticized feels, or being left out after all you've been through, and how badly you really just need to be included and supported. I mean, that's really what's needed, right? You can push the sadness down, but it is sad what trauma does to you, forcing you to be alone just to keep your life manageable. And that grief and that discomfort that pushes you to isolate is the same grief and discomfort that makes isolation feel not so good after a while. That grief and discomfort is the thing that's going to nudge you back into connecting with people once again later, if you allow it. And this time, if you can learn to heal those triggers that make dealing with people so difficult, you can start to connect with them one little step at a time. And I'll explain how to do that in a minute. But first, let's talk about why pushing everyone away feels so natural for traumatized people and so energizing and uplifting, at least at first. So isolating yourself is an instant solution to the stress you feel when your CPTSD symptoms are triggered by something, an argument, you made a mistake, you feel embarrassed, you feel rejected or judged or ugly, or you gained weight, or you feel frazzled. Now, remember, when I say the word triggered, I don't mean the way some people use the word to mean upset or angry. I mean the stimulus or experience or feeling that sets off neurological dysregulation. Your nervous system gets out of sync. It throws you off. And this is a core symptom of childhood trauma that's underneath most of the other symptoms that you might experience. And dysregulation is also why getting triggered by other people can cause your emotions to rise up and your mind starts distorting things. You feel overwhelmed. And honestly, when you get that dysregulated, it can take days to bounce back and feel like yourself. So with a price to pay like that, there's a huge temptation to just avoid the triggers and stay away from people altogether, or to use what I call covert avoidance. And those are strategies that can keep you looking good, like you are connecting with everybody, but really you're just keeping your relationships as hollow as possible, just getting away with the bare minimum of interaction. Because actually showing up for those relationships feels like a risk you can't take. You might not even be conscious of it anymore. It feels like a threat to your nervous system, so you find a way to avoid it and get away with it. Now, it might not be conscious, but you're avoiding commitments, canceling plans, not being really present with people when you're hanging out with them. This is really common for people with CPTSD. Putting yourself out there feels like it's going to be exhausting. It feels like it's going to be just a marathon that never ends. So it's very tempting to keep everyone just at arm's length or to cut yourself off altogether. And by the way, if you feel that childhood trauma has affected your ability to connect and feel comfortable with people, I have a quiz you can take. And you can check your symptoms and see if you've got some of the common ones. There's a link to that down in the description section below if you ever want to take that. Also on the free tools page of my website. It's called the Connection Quiz. So you might want to check that out. So this is the third reason why isolating is so tempting, is that social situations stress you out, and it's just so easy to cancel. If you're a little bit avoidant, I'll bet that you've told every story in the book to get out of plans. Tell them you're sick, tell them you have to work, tell them there's a family emergency. And then people go, oh, okay, well, you go do that. And then you feel like, oh, you're off the hook. Now, you feel a little piece of your integrity fall away, but the relief feels like it's worth it. Or it feels like that in the moment. And you might tell yourself that this is actually empowering to have that control over your time, even though you're kind of being controlled by your triggers. But in the moment, it feels good to have that breathing space, just to get people back out of you, just leave you alone. Now, honestly, it reminds me of when I was a 2-pack-a-day smoker. When I couldn't deal with something, I'd just step outside and have a cig. It changes the scenery. You get to take a break. You breathe deeply. The illusion of self-care, is very compelling, right? Hey, I'm just breathing. So we all want to have a little space when we feel overwhelmed and to have control over our time and our boundaries. But the problem is when you're using isolation as your go-to strategy to achieve those things, then it doesn't work, not in the long run. So the fourth way that isolating tricks you into thinking it deserves to consume your life is when you tell yourself that, yes, you're isolating now, but it's only temporary and you just need a rest. You just don't like this one person, or you just need a little bit of self-care time. And in fact, it feels like self-care. It's like a little luxury retreat, right? With some Hulu and a bunch of carbohydrates and, this is the life. And a little of that, I'll be the first to admit, is very, very nice. But if it's not balanced with getting out in the world some of the time, moving, interacting, earning, contributing, admiring people, supporting them, being supported, how does that feel actually? How does it feel after you've done it for a couple of days in a row, or a couple of weeks, or a couple of years? If you do it enough times, there's a dread feeling that kind of takes hold of your life that can be really hard to push down. You can try by blaming people or society or what happened in the past. That's common. But you're human. You need love and inclusion. I know it's hard sometimes, and I know you've been through so much already. And it's hard. It can be hard to fit in, especially when you're like us. We don't always fit in easily. But there's this huge fact that you still have time to connect with the world. You're meant to be part of this world. You're meant to be part of the web of connection. And yes, trauma robs that from us, but healing gives it back. We don't have to let life pass us by and just tolerate the days until what? Until our lives are over? There's still time. And it's stressful dealing with people, but it's also stressful not having them in your life. So when you're promising yourself that soon you'll get back out there, make the day that you keep that promise today and take a step toward connection again. Remember, the longer you aren't out there, the harder it gets. It does. And sometimes the isolation will cause you to go deeper into behaviors that trigger the urge to isolate. So I totally understand that it can be kind of a downward spiral, at least at first. If you're not actively supporting yourself to stretch your connection skills a little bit, the gravity of isolation can just sort of suck you down. It can attract you to life experiences that generate overwhelm or exhaustion or anything that gives you a reason to pull away, because you can then give yourself permission to keep isolating. If everything overwhelms you, that's when you know you're in a bad spot. It's not going very well for you. It will feel like the world is against you, but usually the real problem is in here. It's a trauma wound. It should never have happened to you, what happened. But here we are. We're banding together to heal. Now, even if your trauma is telling you otherwise, it's so important to heal the urge to isolate and to come out of loneliness, even when it's hard. And the first reason is you need people in your life. I know you know that, and some of you are going to argue with me. No, I don't. Well, we do. We need people in our lives. Somebody's got to grow the food. Somebody's got to build the road. Even if you didn't have emotional needs for people, your immune system needs to be around people. Your mental health needs to experience people. Your physical health needs to be around people. And when you're connecting with people and it's not generating trauma for you, it has powerful balancing effects on all the parts of your life. Being stuck in trauma makes us self-absorbed. And enjoying some interaction with people can take us back out of that self-absorption, which has a funny way of taking up all our mental and emotional space. When we soften that a little, that fear of people, it creates an opening where friendship can form. We forget that. Everything feels so black and white with trauma, but there's a tide of connection that goes in and it goes out. It goes in, it goes out. We put ourselves out there a little and we pull back a little and rest. Then we reach out again, and it's a healing rhythm. Connect, protect, make an effort, rest. Another benefit of connecting is that being with people helps to keep your thinking grounded. And I would just like to point out, some people have felt a little hurt when I say this, but if you've ever known people who aren't into people and they're hiding out and they're avoiding everyone, maybe when you were younger, maybe you saw people who had been doing it for a long time. It's often older people, because they've lived long enough for it to have been a long time, and they've been avoiding life. We had a guy in our neighborhood when I was a kid who would rage at us from an upstairs window for roller skating on his driveway. It was just so smooth and nice, and it was a little bit sloped, and the rest of the sidewalk was really bumpy. And it was the only, we had those little metal roller skate wheels that was all we had. So we needed a smooth driveway to experience anything like roller skating. And so we would try to get away with it. And so I understand. He didn't want us there. He didn't want us messing up his driveway or, getting hurt or something. But he was so mean and so miserable, just banging at us. And I can see now that he had lost his ability to be, he just wasn't socialized anymore. He was so shut down that he had become very rough on the edges, a little feral. And he probably wasn't as awful as he seemed, but his emotions would come out like glass shards, just. And I've been there. There are fears that can get the better of us. Our negative thinking can keep escalating and escalating when there's nobody there to push back on you or give you a reality check. And that's one big way that people like us can get weird. I'm saying it. We get weird, and not in a good way. I believe strongly that our happiness is not just a feeling. It's something that develops as we grow into being our real selves and becoming useful to other people, being of service to them, helping them out a little bit. Not like being codependent, not doing too much, but as a participant, being connected enough that you can show up for people. You can say hello to people who pass you on the sidewalk. You can check on a neighbor. You can run an errand for somebody. You can take a phone call from someone instead of just letting it go to voicemail, if it's someone you know. You can be kind to people, even if it's just a marketing call, actually. Doing this is a kindness, not just to the other person, but to you. You need to be playing this role for your continued development, or it traps you. It's like a developmental barrier. You can't mature if you're not having those interactions with people, a little friction with the world. As we get older, but maybe even now, we depend even more on other people to look after us when we're sick or hurt or need something. And I've been in that place, in the hospital, with no one to visit for weeks, not having anyone to drive me home when I was discharged, and wishing I could stay longer in the hospital just because I didn't feel like I had anywhere to go. For me, that was a wake-up call that I needed to change. And maybe you do too. So think about making this comment. Just say, as best as I can, I'm going to make an effort to connect a little better with people so that I can help them and help myself. When you do this, you've laid the groundwork to begin becoming your full and real self. Because of course, to do that, you need to grow as a person. And to grow as a person, you need that connection in your life, a little friction, something to react to. We need other people so that we can flourish and so that we can experience ourselves and therefore become more fully ourselves. Now, it might not feel possible to you right now to step out of your comfort zone, whether that is deep isolation or the kind that looks like it's functional, but it's actually isolation because no one really knows you. This is the secret. When you learn to notice and heal your triggers, your need to isolate is less. And if you can start to get mastery over those triggers, those emotions and situations that set off your nervous system and make it hard for you to focus or function or feel okay or act normal, you can then gently open your life up to more connection. You're so not alone with this. Remember, I told you, this is an almost universal symptom for people who were neglected and abused when they were growing up. And it's not your fault that happened. But now that you're grown, you can be the one who heals it. You can learn to spot the people who are hurtful and who don't belong in your life. And you can attune yourself to the kind of people you do want in your life. You can take it slowly. You can. You can be yourself. That's what we do here, and it works. We're all works in progress right now, and it feels good to start facing the habits that we formed to protect ourselves so that now we can become the people we really are. It starts with seeing the spots where trauma might still be affecting your ability to connect. When I ask people I coach, what is the biggest, most hard to manage trigger of your childhood PTSD? Most of them say abandonment. And this trigger is so strong and so totally takes over your nervous system and your perception that if you're like a lot of people who were neglected or abandoned as kids, you can't even tell when you're imagining that someone's going to leave you or if your awareness is really pretty accurate and you are seeing what's about to happen. All CPTSD triggers lead to some level of dysregulation of your emotions, your brain, your whole nervous system. And in my experience, healing is virtually impossible until you can learn to get re-regulated. So today I want to share with you a video about getting triggered by abandonment. And this is one of the videos from my Dysregulation Bootcamp, which is a 20-day course that helps you calm your CPTSD triggers so that you can get mastery over your emotions, your thinking, and your physiology so that you can live your life more in harmony with yourself, more regulated, more of the time. It's so powerful when you learn to re-regulate. If you're interested in the Dysregulation Bootcamp, there's a link below. You'll hear me in this video refer to a worksheet, but that's only available in the course itself. That's okay. I'm sharing this because I tell a story here of how triggers can get that power over you. And if you live with a vulnerability around feeling abandoned, my story could just give you some hope. I hope so. If you get dysregulated around the feeling of abandonment, I invite you to check out my Dysregulation Bootcamp, which you can join anytime, and our 4-week coaching program that's all about re-regulation. That starts October 8th, so you should register now. You can do that on my website, crappychildhoodfairy.com. Today we're going to talk about one of the most intense triggers for childhood PTSD, abandonment. This one is so primal because we're all wired to be loved and included in the tribe as if our lives depend on it. Because in any situation before the last, 100 years or so, our lives did depend on it. We need our parents when we're born, and we need dependable people connected to us throughout our lives. So just about everyone, and I know this because I've taught so many people to write their fears each day, and I've heard the things that come up for everyone. Being left by the tribe is a core fear. It comes out as fear of ending up alone and homeless and dying alone. And the fear isn't irrational, really. It's a standard feature of being a Homo sapien. But for those of us with childhood PTSD, it can go way out of proportion to the situation, to the point of being crippling, and it can make us seem really unreasonable. In my childhood, my mother would leave the family for a month at a time, starting when I was a month old. She'd run off with some guy and not tell anyone where she was or if she was coming back. Now, she did come back, but the family would be in anguish and frantic with uncertainty, and this was going on all around me while I was a small kid. And then when I was about 5, she'd sometimes take me with her and leave me for a moment in a lobby or for a couple of hours in a movie theater. And then she would not come back for 10, 11 hours. And the police picked me up once outside a casino. That's when I was 6. I hadn't eaten all day. I had a fever. Now, nowadays, you'd lose your kids over something like that, but not back then. And I was scrambling to cover for her because, of course, I didn't want them to take me away from her. But you can see where I got kind of a weird thing around abandonment. And that carried into my adulthood. And it certainly kicked up when I started having groups of friends, then boyfriends, and then working and trying to fit in. All situations where sometimes there's rejection. And before I learned to stay regulated, any rejection, I'll tell you what it felt like. It was as if I'd been injected with a toxic chemical. I'm assuming it was a release of some stress hormone, and I could feel that bad feeling just like flowing through my bloodstream. And I'd think, oh no, here it goes again. And I'd fall into a very dark kind of dysregulation, and there would be nothing I could do to stop it. That's a trigger. So you'll be tempted on the worksheet to put a lot of work into understanding why you have certain triggers like this one, just like I told you why. And knowing this, that's possibly helpful. Maybe you'll better understand that your reactions to abandonment are not your fault. You didn't just make it up. But I'm going to direct the majority of your focus to just remembering and noticing what it feels like when you're triggered by abandonment. What in your adult life recently has set it off? And what was it about those situations that seems to get to you so badly? So that's all in the worksheet, along with reflection on how you've come back from abandonment. Totally important, right? One thing that's going to help you tremendously with dislodging those deep-rooted triggers that have an early and understandable origin is the daily practice. When you write your fears and resentments, you can pour out whatever is coming up on a hard day when your fear of abandonment got triggered. Fear, no one likes me. Fear, I don't know what just happened. Fear, I'll end up alone when I'm old. And I'm resentful at my girlfriend because I have fear she didn't text me back last night, and so on. Deep triggers aren't going to change because you merely decide to change. It's not likely anyway. They change when you can access that pre-language part of your brain where the abandonment hurt was installed. And language out through writing, not speaking, writing what that feeling is that's happening, the terror, the self-hatred, whatever it is for you. You write it, you meditate, and you'll find that the emotions are calmer and they're lying low for the time being. And your thinking is clearer. Like maybe you don't have to freak out and act jealous this time. Maybe you can forget about it. Or maybe you're sick of all the fear involved in a relationship and you want to end it. There's no right answer here. The point is that all options are open to you and you're no longer enslaved by a fear of that physiological hell associated with abandonment that limits so many of us with childhood PTSD. People ask me about my favorite videos that I've created about trauma, and I've got one I want to share with you here. It's about the triggers that you might notice in yourself now that are the tell that you were neglected and ostracized as a kid. And this one was really powerful for my viewers at the time, and if you struggle with feeling left out, this one is for you. Nobody likes being ignored and left out or just left behind. And so many people with childhood PTSD have it because of these experiences when they were small. Now, maybe your parents were alcoholic or addicted and turned off like a light switch when it was time to give you attention and support. Or maybe one of your parents died or was locked up or just left you like you never existed. And not only was this terrible to happen to you as a kid, to any child, but it can really muck up your adult relationships with anxieties and longings that can really drive away any possibility of genuine, stable connections with people, romantic or otherwise. Abandonment wounds push you into relationships too quickly. The slow pathway, that just wasn't even encoded in your nervous system, but I promise you, you can learn to do it with some techniques, and I do teach that. But when you were a kid, you didn't learn the slow way. And then when you find yourself attached to someone you can't stand or who treats you badly, you may feel like you can't leave because your abandonment triggers kick in and make it feel like leaving would be almost worse than dying. So you go in too fast and then you can't leave. That's how people get stuck. And abandonment wounds can also show up in group dynamics where, I'm willing to lay money on it, you've had horrible experiences of being ostracized, left out, judged by peer groups. And I'll talk about that in this video too. I'm going to talk about why these wounds are so hard to observe in yourself when you kind of flip out on someone because your abandonment wounds get set off. It's like you're not even yourself. And the desperate and sometimes overly intense reaction to feeling abandoned, even when it's just a feeling and no one has actually done it to you in that moment, it's almost like a bad dream. What it actually is an emotional flashback, which is normal with CPTSD. An emotional state from the past comes back and overlays your present time experience. Someone walks out of the room when you're trying to talk to them, and this tsunami of desperation and grief can come over you. That's an abandonment wound. And next thing you know, you're calling them names, you're threatening to leave, you're crying, it feels like your life is over. That's what we call abandonment melange. That's a word Pete Walker contributed to the literature, and it's such a good concept of the intense grief and rage and panic that can come over people when the feeling of abandonment happens, and it's drawing through this emotional flashback on what happened to them as a kid. And I want to talk about why that happens and how emotional injuries that happen before you even had language show up like that as just overpowering emotions that aren't connected to present day circumstances. And you don't even know where they came from, but they are upon you and they feel real. So let's just go over some common triggers that you see in people who were abandoned as kids. The really valuable thing about looking at triggers is that everything that is a symptom of CPTSD only occurs if it gets triggered. And that includes, the neurological dysregulation, disconnecting from people, going into self-defeating behaviors of lashing out, running away, smoking, there's so many self-defeating behaviors. But all of that sort of calms down. It goes dormant like like chickenpox virus if you're not getting triggered. So you can't stop the world from triggering you, but you can learn to calm how you respond to triggers once you know what they are and you have the tools. So let's talk about some of the triggers that can really get you when you have abandonment wounds. One of them is when somebody walks out of the room, if they storm out when you're in the middle of talking. This is a really normal thing. There are some people, including some people with CPTSD, but all kinds of people, when a conversation gets intense, how they sort of self-regulate is they get physical distance for a minute. So they might stroll out of the room for a minute. Now, this is really different than saying, that's it, it's over, and they leave and pack a suitcase and they're out the door. But even that can be the same
impulse, the same coping mechanism to flee. So somebody who is like actually in the relationship and will come back in the room in just a few minutes sometimes walks out of the room and just goes, oh gosh, I just can't deal with this conversation. For a person with CPTSD, that can be so triggering. It brings back, some memory that you don't even have anymore. When you didn't have words, like before the age of 3 or so, you can't really form memories. And so all you remember is the emotion. You can't remember the event. But it's not uncommon in people who grew up in unstable households where there was fighting or addiction or, trauma going on, that would have happened, that your needs would have been neglected, that you would have cried for a very long time in a wet diaper. And that's where these wounds come from. So it's not going to come back as, this reminds me of when I was crying all alone. Like, you won't have that memory, but you'll remember the feeling. And the feeling comes up, and since it's not attached to a cognition of what it was, of what the memory is, it just feels like it's happening right now. And you just think, this terrible person who's making me feel this way, I have got to shut down this relationship. Then, if you have typical CPTSD that wants to do that, that has that reaction to things, maybe an hour later, when you start calming down or when you start going into dissociation and the emotions are calmer, then your emotions come back and you go, oh dear, what have I done? Oh dear, what have I done? If you have the kind of CPTSD I have, you've probably done that before. You may have ruined relationships with it before. All right, similar to that trigger is the silent treatment. Now, the silent treatment, there's minor forms of it where somebody's just like, I'm not going to talk about it with you. And then there's one where, somebody living with you or all the kids at school, they turn their back and they won't talk to you. They shun you. They refuse, there's stonewalling where I won't talk about it. And then there is the silent treatment. And either way, this can be extremely triggering for somebody who was rejected or neglected as a kid. We can't control what other people do, but I would say the silent treatment is emotionally immature. It's not a good way to handle conflict with somebody. And at the extreme, it can be emotional abuse. So I don't recommend doing it or staying with people who keep doing it and don't intend to change it. All right, a third trigger that really gets people who were abandoned as kids is waiting, having to wait for somebody. Now, maybe you were a kid who got left in daycare until the last minute or even later, or your parents were separated and you sat by the window all of Saturday afternoon waiting for your dad to come and pick you up for his time with you and he didn't show. Waiting and not having your needs met is a big thing that can cause CPTSD in the first place. So a lot of people who have this wound, any kind of waiting does it. And the thing is, when it happens, because it's triggering CPTSD, it simultaneously triggers kind of a fog where you go, I think I'm freaking out about getting stood up for this person who said they would come. And then your mind plays a trick and goes, well, it's probably my fault. It's probably just me. And maybe, should I be mad about this? And I get a lot of letters from people where they're like, is it just me? And so sometimes I or our community come in the membership community that we have, people can pose those questions in our secret Facebook group, like, is it just me? Or when this guy said he would call me this weekend for the plan and then he didn't call and I waited all day, is that bad? And everybody can go, yeah, that was bad. Maybe some people don't mind being treated like that, but you do, and it's not a happy thing. And it's not a good sign for a relationship. And if it's something that you don't have a boundary around, I have good news for you. You can make a boundary around it. And then future people won't get very far with you if they treat you like that. All right, number 4, feeling jealous and getting gaslit about it. Now, I think this happens a lot when you're dating, that you break up with somebody and then they say, we're just going to be friends, right? Let's just stay friends. And you think, oh yeah, I should do that. That's what people do. And then you have to watch them eventually get together with somebody new and pretend like you're the cool girl, but you're actually jealous and you have to pretend you're not jealous. Anything where something feels terrible to you, but you have to pretend it's not terrible is putting you in danger of like dissociating. And this is something that's been very hard about the age of division that happens over social media, is that people can do terrible things and say terrible things and you can't defend yourself, because if you do and you say anything, you could get attacked by trolls, you could get canceled. We have thousands of people who are going into their CPTSD because they can't speak up, and when people just make up stuff about them. And it's terrifying. It's horrible. And it is a form of narcissistic abuse when people do that to each other. So if you grew up with parents who were neglectful, and for all the reasons they get neglectful, because, you know, they have personality disorders, they're drunk, they're high, they're totally selfish. If that's what was happening, you got told all the time, you know, you got treated badly, and then you're like, oh, get over it, or oh, stop being such a worrywart, or oh, you're just, you know, you're being so old-fashioned. I got that all the time as a kid, and I was very sensitive about it until I learned to calm those triggers a little better. But I can't stand it when I know very well that something bothers me and I'm shamed for being bothered. Now, like everybody else, I've had to be in situations and jobs where something really bothered me and there was nothing that could be done about it. You know, having a boss who didn't think that I was valuable enough to promote. So some of these things, it's life. It's where it is. And when that happens, you know, if you're an autonomous person, it's time to change jobs, for example, or you're dating somebody but I wanted to get to this thing where you get gaslit in present time, right? You're dating somebody and they want to hang out with their ex and you're supposed to be cool about it. You're getting gaslit. Like, what's the matter? Why are you so jealous? You just have jealousy. Jealousy is how people feel when they have an expectation of loyalty or monogamy and they feel threatened. And yes, I totally have met people where the jealousy is just kind of rampant. It's not really tied to reality. That can happen, but it's also something that is natural. And if you've been told, like, you don't get to hold out for that, you actually don't have to agree to be an ex's buddy, and you don't have to agree to be okay dating somebody who hangs out with their ex. You get to actually have your boundaries about that, and you get to maybe test out, okay, I think I'm okay with it, and then you're like, I'm not okay with it, actually. And you get to not be okay with it. Don't kid yourself. Don't try to pretend you're somebody you're not, because that can just bring on the old trigger of being abandoned. It is a huge abandonment trigger to be afraid that somebody's going to leave you. And there's part of that that's just baked into relationships, especially in the early stages, especially when you're young. Like that's part of it. But how you can keep yourself healing and intact as a person with CPTSD is to be very clear with yourself about what your boundaries are about that. And to go very slowly in relationships so that you can refrain from attaching too strong before you know if this is somebody who matches you in terms of what you need and expect out of the relationship. Another trigger for people who are abandoned is empty time, when there's nothing scheduled. You may find yourself, maybe you overfunction, you fill up all your time. You do frivolous socializing just because the thought of being on your own for an evening just makes you kind of anxious. Maybe a lot of feelings come up. So here's what's really great about the path of healing from trauma is it involves tools that help you make the most of the feelings that come up. So it's actually very fruitful sometimes to be alone for an evening, even when you feel lonely. You sit down and you write your fears and resentments in the way that I teach. And a lot more is going to come up when you're feeling a little bit alone. Less will come up when everybody's waiting for you because everybody's going to go to the restaurant, right? You're going to be like, blah, 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 and go on. But when you're lonely, that can be a fruitful kind of loneliness, is to go ahead and face what's in there. And some of my most powerful experiences of healing have been on those really dark nights of the soul when I was feeling so alone. So empty time can be used very fruitfully for something, and that's healing. All right, number 6, closeness with loved ones can be a trigger. It's kind of ironic, right? It's like not having closeness is a trigger, but sometimes when people really show up and look you in the eye and they love you. And for this, I always think about when I was 15, my dad died of ALS. And a few months before he died, I had to travel from one state to another to visit him. And so the last time I saw him was 4 months before he died. And I will never forget, he was so sad when he said goodbye. He was standing in his driveway, smiling and waving and saying goodbye. And I wanted to run to him and just hug him. But the whole thing was so weird and uncomfortable, I just couldn't. So the intensity of his feelings, of his wanting to give me all that love for the rest of my life, was like a fire hose. It was like trying to drink out of a fire hose, and I couldn't deal with it. And it was a trigger for me. So I was, to have my dad die when I was still a youngster like that, it is a classic form of abandonment. He didn't do it on purpose. He never would have done it if he could have helped it. But first my parents got divorced, and then my mom moved us out of state. And I lost my dad in these stages. And it really, really affected me. And I have no doubt it affected how I approached relationships later. So I've still had time now to reflect on that love that I saw in his face and that I remember through his actions. And he wrote me a series of letters to let me know how much he loved me. He knew he was dying. We all knew. And I still have them. And from time to time, I take them out. And it has to be very time to time. It's so intense to have somebody give you a lifetime of love like that in a letter. And I'm very grateful I have it. I realize some people never even got that. But I thought I didn't get anything. And then later I recovered in the letters, and I realized he sort of encapsulated his love so that when I was older, I could get it. And it even says that in one of the letters. I'm writing this down because I think when you're older, it will make more sense to you, and you'll be able to appreciate it. And he told me what his work was, what he actually did at work, and told me some stories from his childhood. So it was really great because there just wasn't time. I never got to know him as an adult. And I'm way older now than he was when he died, which is funny to think. And I still miss him. Yeah, still miss him. So, all right, number 7 is watching other people enjoy social ease. Like, why didn't I get the memo? You got triggers installed instead, right? So it can be a trigger for your abandonment when you see other people just not being so effed up in social situations and comparing yourself or imagining that they're okay. One thing I've learned over time is people don't always feel as at ease as you think, but some do. It's true. Some are just like, la la, everything's great. I'm confident. I feel like I fit in everywhere I go. Well, I don't. That's not how I feel. And so sometimes watching them, I start to compare myself, and then I go into the abandonment thing. I'm going to get left out. I just know it's coming. I'll take myself out preemptively. Did you ever do that? I did. All right, another trigger can be seeing other people happy, and you feel like you should be happy. There's no reason you aren't, but you're not happy. You feel shame or ostracized, or you just know in your bones you're never going to fit in. Sometimes, though, you are ostracized because of something about you. Maybe you're prickly. Maybe you don't contribute enough. Maybe you have a vibe that's very stressed out or angry, right? And you might be in a state of confusion about why this is. You think, oh, these other people are terrible. Sometimes people actually are terrible, and you just haven't had enough healing to choose people that are great, that you feel good with. Sometimes you go into blame, like you just don't feel okay in yourself, and your reflex is to blame other people. And people have nervous systems, so no matter how polite or kind your words are, if you're feeling kind of like with other people, they feel it, and you will find people pulling away. And that has been a lot of my experience in life, where if I were to ask people, how come I'm not included? Not that I did, but if I did, they would have just said, I don't know, you're included. I don't know what you're saying. But I just didn't have a very inviting demeanor. I wasn't positive about getting together. I almost was looking for a way to get left out because I felt so triggered by the whole question of whether I was going to be included, And so when you're healed, you have a little bit more like latitude you get those fears and resentments on paper about that could happen or has happened. And then you just kind of like give it your best shot. And you just go, hey, do you want to hang out? Or, hey, can I tag along? And then you only have to like feel terrible and embarrassed if you and you still don't have to feel terrible and embarrassed, but they could actually reject you. But that's almost never what's going on. So we work on ourselves, and then we work on being free enough to express ourselves and ask for what we want. There's always a component of working on ourselves so that we can be nice, good people that people want to hang out with. And that's not a given for everybody with trauma. So I'm kind of talking about how a history of abandonment leads to a present day feeling ostracized. And it is so hard to be ostracized. It does happen for real sometimes. Sometimes there is an overlay. Sometimes people really are just being wicked. Sometimes your trauma wounds are kind of adding to it, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But for ostracization, a trigger is being in groups at all, Like just believing I don't belong, I never do, I'm uncomfortable, I'm triggered, I didn't get the memo, I don't like these people, they're also stuck up, they're also perfect, they're also normal, you know, whatever your judgment is. It's not a friendly vibe, right? Second one is feeling overlooked, right? Did you ever do this when you were in school, when you raised your hand with an answer and somebody else got called on, and then you go, oh no, I wasn't raising my hand. It's this weird shame that some of us feel about like offering ourselves and then getting overlooked. It's like shameful or something. If you stand outside of it and you just think of a little kid raising her hand in class, it's okay. Not everybody can get called on. And so you may have learned, don't raise your hand. Just sit there and act like you don't know the answer either, which is a way to take yourself out of the mix preemptively so you never have to feel ashamed about not getting called on. And this can be applied to jobs and relationships and friend groups and family stuff. And so it really takes a lot of courage to just put yourself out there for what you want afterwards. All right, another trigger, feeling judged, not accepting yourself. You know, if you're feeling judged by other people, I can almost guarantee you have a component of not feeling okay yourself about what you're doing, who you are. And your first order of business is always going to be to work on that, to work on yourself. All right, here's another one. You know you don't belong, but what happened was you were just crap fitting with this group anyway, just so that you could have people to hang out with. And isn't it funny how you can do that sometimes and just be like, I don't like these people, I don't fit in. So there you have it. You know, when you hang out with people just to use them to fill up your time, that can happen. Number 6, feeling condescended to. That comes from fearing you're not enough, that you don't know enough. And yes, some people are very condescending. Ugh, and it's a trigger. It's a trigger I really don't like. I don't like, you know, when people assume that I don't know something and they explain it to me, and it happens all the time. And I used to get very prickly and want to tell them, look, I know that, I know. And my healing at this stage is I don't even bother. I'm just like, all right, thank you. Because I don't think it's very polite behavior, but I don't feel like taking it on or getting into conflict with people. I just as soon, you know, carry on and keep all my self-regulation available for myself to use. So what can you do about these triggers? The world doesn't stop showing them to you. The one thing that can change is your trauma-driven response, where you shut down, you pull away, you lash out, or you avoid people and you avoid your potential as your only means to control the damage that happens when those responses get unleashed. But that's not great, right? You taking yourself out is you taking yourself out. You can heal your responses when you feel triggered, and even the abandonment ones. And it starts by learning to notice and calm those triggers. When you know what's happening, it stops feeling like it's just consuming you, drowning you. That it stops feeling so real, frankly. A little space appears where you see that you have a choice. And I learned how to do this with the techniques that I call the daily practice. And it's made a huge difference in my life. And it keeps making a difference that I've pretty much devoted my life, you know, to sharing it with everyone who needs that. That's a lot what this channel is for. And that's what I love about YouTube. Hundreds of thousands of people are using the techniques now. And if you haven't tried them yet, I hope you'll give it a try. See what it does for you.